So good afternoon to you all. I'm Dennis Boyer, the president of the Nonprofit Net Board, welcoming you to today's Zoominar on what to do and not do when your executive director leads. If you're not already familiar with us, our Zoominars are open to everyone without charge, and yet they're not totally free because we do have expenses for bringing each one to you. So we hope you'll consider supporting us with a suggested donation of $10 or $20, maybe even more. NPN needs your support to keep the Zoominars coming your way. So I'm sending you a link, or I will be, to the donation page through the Zoom chat. We'd also appreciate your feedback. It helps us plan, and it's very important to the speakers. So I'll include a link to that as well. On to today's presentation now. Organizations sometimes make mistakes when there's a leadership change. And today, you're going to learn what those mistakes are and how to avoid them. Our speaker, Paul TonThat, has a wealth of CEO-level experience. He's provided interim leadership for multiple organizations. He's currently executive director at Nuestra CDC. He's also a principal and managing member at the consulting firm TCF Collaborative, LLC, and is a board member of Nonprofit Net. Welcome to you, Paul.
Well, thank you. I hope everybody can hear. So just a few things. I wanted to say that I am truly intimidated because so many of my colleagues that I know are here, and folks I know in the field are here. So I need to get this right. Second, I hope to make this much more a kind of an interactive conversation. So I'm going to share with you before the slide goes on that there are basically 6 areas that I'm going to hit. And I'm going to ask you to kind of think through where your question lies. And we can talk about it now. And then when we hit that area, we can explore that further so that this will be truly interactive. I just wanted to confirm, Dennis, are you going to share the slide, or am I?
I was expecting that you would. I can do it if you wish.
If you could, I'd be grateful.
Okay.
So I'll just begin and just basically the talk today covers kind of 6 areas or 6 phases, if you want. All of them are kind of affect each other and sometimes interact with each other. So I'm going to share with you what they are, and then those who have questions, if you could, kind of, if you don't know where it fits, we can talk about it, and then when we get there, we can chat about where that fits. So the first area is just a conversation about what exactly is executive transition, right? And the second is, how does a board or an organization prepare for one? The third one is, how do you, besides the preparation, how do you, what are some of the best practice about a continuity plan? And that's where you either have the exec who's retiring or leaving stay on for a while until they leave, or that's where you're putting in an interim, and we can talk about that. Then the third part, which is really important, is how do you handle, or should we think about handling, the communication? And no matter how much you think you've done, it's not enough. So communication, 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 we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the search process, what's involved, what should you be planning for, what are the pitfalls, and then the last and probably one of the most critical is, how do you onboard your new ED, and how do you manage the expectation, particularly for the first year and a half? So Before I go on, just want to make sure that we can, Dennis, that you shared the slides. So before we share the slides, any questions, and where should I advise you to kind of slot them in? I know that before we start, there's a whole series of folks who did share some questions, but now I'm going to open it up for the participants. Do you have questions? Okay. I see. Okay. So I'll just quickly read some of the questions that people had posed when they signed up. Right. So folks basically they're undergoing a leadership transition at this point. There are another group that says that in the next few years, there will be in a new ED, perhaps supervision, and starting to plan for that transition. A third person talk about how can one make transition as easy as possible for staff. And then there is also the question that says that our CEO is leaving at the end of the year. Sorry, let me just blocking out my own question. Yeah. So, what should they anticipate? And then there's also one that says, how do you find an new executive director, and what are the responsibilities of an executive director? And then there's an organization that talked about basically creating a different management structure to be without an ED. And then many folks talk about the EDs retiring. So I'm just going to make sure that I can see the chat. Great. So let me begin the kind of the first set of slides. If you could begin for me, let me see if I can forward this.
Well, if it's not working for you, just say slide and I'll trigger it.
Oh, yes. Could you please forward the slide to the first page? Is that moving?
It's not moving, so we'll try to figure out why.
So let me
there we go.
folks there. Thank you. So the CEO transition or ED transitions are a lot more complex than a hiring process. Folks often think that basically it's a senior staff and the hiring process is the same, but really what it actually does is that what really is happening is you're taking, particularly if the ED's been there for a bit, you're taking a person who has basically built a culture and a whole series of social contracts on how to run an organization, and then that person is leaving. So what you're facing is not just a person switching jobs, but basically the systems, contracts, social and otherwise, under him or her is going to be revisited and changed. And so it's much more of a organizational transition process than a job switch. The the other piece about a process in which when this thing happens is that not everybody in the organization, and that includes board and staff, realizes what's happening emotionally and systematically until they've got to experience the process, meaning many staff have agreed to work within a particular way and in particular spheres. And their first inkling thought when an ED is leaving is, sure, I'll continue to be in that space and we'll just need to find somebody else who can come in. But the reality is that after a few moments, sometimes days, sometimes months, that senior staff is going to rethink their contract with the organization and need to or want to grow and negotiate that space, right? So ED transition, as I said, it takes a series of work, and it is as much an emotional process as a technical one. And the biggest mistake that boards make is that they think that this is a quick process. You basically fill out the job description, go out, hire the firm, and then put somebody in just like that or opposite to that, however they were thinking. And when they insert that person in, the organization is still going through a process of renegotiation and the fit's terrible. So I'm going to pause right here. And if folks have any questions around what some of the examples you've experienced and what are some of the kind of issues that you've seen that one wants to engage in that particular context. Yes.
As a staff, how can you be supportive of the ED that's transitioning out? I know there's that part that I can't, the emotional piece, I can't control that, but how can I make sure that this transition is an effective one, if that makes any sense?
So I think that the best answer to that is that as a staff, the best thing that you could contribute to this whole process is understand your own emotional and professional journey that you're going through in a fairly short period of time, right? What is your immediate feeling about loss or not? What are you thinking about, and how do you want to change the way you work? And the quicker, the better you get all of that on paper, the more you can be helpful to kind of engage with a process that hopefully a wise chair or a transition committee on the board is leading, and they should be aware that that is happening on multiple levels at all the places in the organization. Other questions? There was a really good one. So I can't see you all because of the limits of Zoom. So please feel free to ask the questions. You don't have to raise your hand. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, Dennis. That's page 4. So the question is, how does an organization prepare for leadership change? And when does it prepare for leadership change? And the answer is that it prepares for leadership change all the time. It needs to anticipate and be ready for leadership change. And not all leadership change come because you've planned it. many leadership change come unplanned, but a board should should basically be prepared to engage. Sorry, I think we've been on this one. I'm looking for page 4.
Sorry, Paul, my vision is limited as well. What page are we on?
Oh, we're page 1, I believe. So
This is 1?
I think,
Okay.
I believe, yeah. No, that's the
numbered.
4th point. Sorry. One, it says, now let's take a look at 6 tasks. Understand.
Oh, that's way back.
Okay. Yeah.
Nope.
Okay. So we talked about this a bit already, and I'll move on quickly to this. So as we said, let me go back to understanding and guiding the transition. First, this is a multi-month process, right? Sometimes it's a multi-year process, depending on where the state of the organization is. And feeling out that sense requires a kind of for the board to understand where the organization is, and I'll come back and tell you why it's a multi-month process and sometimes multi-year process, and how do you guide this through, right? So if the organization, and we'll talk about that in a section, is truly prepared for leadership change, and it knows, what its executive director is doing at what phases of their strategy this person is working on, and that for the most part the organization is on track with all of the things firing, then then the process is only multi-month. The search process alone is about 4 to 5 months, right? That process alone, because you have to find a search firm, the search firm has to find out what you need, and then the whole recruiting process takes another 2 to 3 months, and then people, if they are leaving their job, need to give notice. And so the search process alone is somewhere between 4 to 6 months before you have an executive director. And that is if you are ready to go. But if you're not, if the organization needs to be, the board knows, works with the organization, it needs to be at a particular place, or things need to be tightened. And part of that work is going to be done by an interim. You will have to kind of afford that. And in the middle of all of that, as the process goes on, staff's feeling about where they belong and how they belong and what they do slightly evolves, right? So those are the factors where managing this is a complex piece, and also you have to really keep really tight sense about where the staff is, and frankly where the organization is. I'm going to go to the next slide if there's no other question. Are there other questions? I think we've hit this. So so the next slide is page 4, and it sorry, it's page there. That is it, right? So we talk about organizational readiness. Again, if the organization is ready, and it should be always prepared to be ready. I work with several organizations who have built in, plans just in case something happens to the CEO. And there are clear succession plans, and the succession plans are for matters of kind of illness or injury. It is not necessarily a successor built in to run the organization permanently, but as a succession plan so that the organization will run should something happen to the CEO. So it is clearly spelled who takes what tasks when the CEO is injured or steps down. And that's very helpful in the process of a transition, regardless of whether or not you're having an internal or external person running the organization. And we'll talk about that. And then the teams, right? Is the board ready to be thinking about this? Is there a transition committee, right? Has the frankly departing or the senior managers talk to each other? Do they fully understand their role? And it's not one of those organizations where the ED does everything, or it seems, and people don't know the various parts of where everything, in other words, where the boundaries of each role is, right? The team's got to be able to run the organization, and executive leadership has to be defined and measured so that it is so that one knows what exactly one is replacing, right? So I'll pause here. Other questions about preparation for leadership change?
How should the executive director that will be entering into the role of the previous executive director like prepare during this transition, like especially if the transition, you have 2 months to maximize the time of the previous institutional knowledge vote individual that's going to be going off? How do you best use that time, in your opinion?
So I think that question is actually really good. This is assuming you've already chosen a new ED and the other one is transitioning out, right? And you're talking about the overlap. That's on the onboarding process. If I could pick up this conversation towards the end, this is really just even before this preparing for leadership changes. This is even before you are in need of replacing an ED. This is just an organization's always understanding that the scope and definition of the ED's work is well defined, right? And the scope of each manager, senior team below or on the side of him or her are well defined, so that when there is leadership change, there isn't kind of a redefinition of everything, just figuring out how to replace that executive functionality. Right. So we can go to the on page 6, which is about leadership continuity. So the goal here is that if you have an executive director who is retiring or leaving for a job, and he or she knows how long or is thinking about moving on, that's where I think a clear negotiated plan with the board should be in place. If they are, particularly in the context of retirement, if they're retiring and they know that they will be leaving in 6 months, then it is clear that that person has 6 months to stay. The communication should begin with staff and with stakeholders, that person should start to prepare and codify kind of their knowledge and information. This is also where they should be placing and meeting with each senior staff to make sure that their sphere of responsibility, they have basically transferred as much as possible, filling in kind of institutional knowledge, and basically prepare a fairly extensive package for onboarding, right? Everything from institutional knowledge, the stories about the beginning of the organization, to where all the banks account, what are all the corporations, where are all the grants, all the passwords, all of that stuff. That should be in a large transition plan. So the question earlier was, how does that overlap occur? If the outgoing ED is prepared and have done all that, the overlap shouldn't take that long. All that information is there. What one has to make sure is that if there is an overlap, and there are two EDs in this space, that one, the new one is seen as clearly as the one in charge, and the other one are only there as a kind of consultative presence, right? If you don't have that situation, then you will need to look for an interim CEO. And they are, I saw David on the call here, so I'm going to call on him in a moment. But interim CEOs are specially wired, strange human beings, and they are incredibly emotionally intelligent human beings. Their focus oftentimes is short, meaning they put a great deal, in my opinion, interim CEOs must understand the business model of the organization, not what the organization says is the business model, but what the real business model of the organization is, because the interim CEOs got to keep the organization going. And oftentimes they're also the bridge. So if the ED has already left or the transition is with them, they also have to get all of this information, codify it, prepare it so that when the new ED comes, they can transfer as much information as they can. I'm going to pause here. There are a lot of very experienced folks here, and love to have some questions about ensuring leadership continuity, particularly around interims.
Hi, Paul. Good to see you. It's
Hi,
been a
David.
while. Yeah, I think you're making some really good points here, and I think you're right. The characteristics of an interim are very different from a permanent ED. Many have been permanent EDs, but really come into an organization to tap the expertise that's already there, and to sort of to get the organization to a really solid footing with what talent is in place and with what culture is in place, as opposed to often a new ED, which is why you were referring before, can be so challenging to bring in a new ED, sort of comes in with their own mindset about where they want to take the organization and what they want to do. And it's really a clear distinction, because ideally, if you are able to get an organization to a place where the team that's already in place is really doing a great job, then a new person coming in doesn't have to go change anything, they build. And that makes them much more likely, I think, to be successful in those roles. So thanks for doing this seminar.
Well, thank you for your many years of experience and wisdom. Other questions here, because I think that there are people who, I know that in the questions earlier, there are people who are wondering, what is it, is this a cool thing to be interim? You know, how does one get into the business? And my recommendation, I've been doing this on and off for about 20 years. And my recommendation is that if you could possibly do anything else, do anything else. This is a manic type work. It is very intense. You walk into an organization and in no time at all, you have to know the culture of that organization, feel it out, sort it out. You've got to basically make social contracts that work for the entire team or most of the team for you to basically be successful. And I said earlier, you've got to know the business model. And also, David is correct. We always hope that the internal capacity is always there, but sometimes the internal capacity is not. And that means that you have to have a fairly wide network of folks who can help the organization very quickly. So, other questions?
Paul, this is Dennis. A short while ago, Kelly had raised her hand. I don't know if you answered her question or if she still has it.
Hi, I had a question about interim executive directors. If they don't plan to apply for the permanent role and will be going back to their previous position, do you have any advice about how to make that a smooth transition once the new person is in place?
So you're talking about somebody who basically is stepping up to run the organization and then stepping back when the new person comes in? Is that, I'm just trying to, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So again, this is, you know, there is no right answer to this, but if at all possible, avoid that. The part of the reason for that is that your social contract with your colleague, with the board will change once you step into that role, right? And whether you are amazingly successful or so successful, stepping back into your old role is difficult. And many times the internal boards and organizations kind of like to play it safe or do not fully understand the transition process, and they'll put an internal person in. And so often that person won't stay because their relationship with the organization have changed, their perspectives have changed, and you cannot kind of undo that evolution. So that's why we recommend in the transition business that if you don't, if you know your ED is not retiring and taking time and kind of doing all of this, then consider bringing in an outside person, because they will go, and frankly, it is their job to deal with their own emotional changes and not affect you.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Other brilliant question. Other questions around interim? So, super. I at the end we can always you know, re-loop and talk about that. And now we'll move on to managing communication and ensuring closure. So clearly a nonprofit, when this happens, or even a for-profit, your business partners, your funders, and all of those, your key stakeholders want to be in the know, right? There is nothing more frightening for funders and business partners than working tightly hand in hand with an organization, and then all of a sudden things change and there's no news, right? And one has to kind of speculate and then listen to the grapevine, and that grapevine may or may not be accurate. And so the best thing is for the board to be totally transparent as one can be with staff about what the process is, whether or not there's a new interim or the ED is staying on for X amount, how long. Understanding that once that is said, you are setting in place, and again, an emotional process onto staff, and they are going to evolve. So be on top of that process, evolve with staff, and communicate. Right. It is also clear to important to have conversations with key stakeholders, funders, but not only funders, banks, and other financial institutions who have lines of credit out on the organization, and just keep them updated. It is actually good to do 30 to 60-day briefing constantly with these folks, just to let them know. Usually the board chair or head of the transition committee does that. This becomes fairly time-intensive time for the board chair or the head of the transition committee. And then also in this process, for the outgoing executive, understand that there will be also an emotional phase around closure. That has to happen not only for him or her, that also has to happen for staff, right? And so there have to be specific events that one think about, that kind of marks and allow folks through this, whether it's a goodbye or some sort of a series of events that folks can kind of allow themselves to let go, depending on these their feelings through this. And all that work seems to be kind of hand-holding, but they're really not. If people don't come to terms with all of this, then that will reflect in the relationship at work, and it will reflect in how difficult the transition for the new person will be. This is probably the least clear, most kind of touchy-feely of the points, but really critical. I remembered a good colleague of mine who left an organization, thought he did it really well, didn't want a goodbye party, and then realized that he couldn't really start his new work properly and needed to go throw himself a party, even though it's just a few people, a person, to work through the process so that he can begin a new place. So if that's happening to the ED, that's also happening to staff. And then here we talk about the search. And this is where, as folks in the interim business, we have a lot of opinions. So before I share with you some points, any questions about search firm, why there's so many of them, why are they so expensive, and is there any other work other than working for search firms today? No, not really, but any questions? And again, I can't see your hand, so please just speak up.
I have a question or possible strategies for when you do hire a new ED and you have worked with your staff, and in our case, we only have volunteers. So we have an executive director and volunteers. Our ED left suddenly. And so we hired one, as I'm looking at these slides, probably a little too quickly. And during that period of time while we were in search for an ED, we did do an okay job of communicating with the volunteers to let them know what we were doing as a board and how important their continued volunteering and input what was to the success of the organization. Now that the ED is on board, I feel like the board wants to check in with the volunteers to see how they think it's going, but I don't want to undermine the new ED. And since the board is somewhat more removed from the daily operations, although we're trying to get better at that, it's the volunteers that are with the executive director day in and day out. So, and the whole organization actually would fall apart if our volunteers weren't happy, and wouldn't be willing to stay. So I was wondering any strategies or is it even appropriate for the board without the executive director's knowledge or with the executive director's knowledge to reach out to the staff, or in our case, the volunteers, and say, how's it going? What do you think? Blah, blah, blah.
So super, and I will touch on that, on the onboarding function and some of the requirements that you may want to put in on the ED's slate of responsibility. So if that's okay, I'll
Sure.
pick that up. But super question. So let me jump into the search process, and this is where I, as the working for almost 20 years in the interim business, see that things, frankly, after intense focus, intense sensitivity, with many boards do this brilliantly. This is where a lot of them trip, right? And first and foremost, the issue is that boards, when they find an interim executive director, they go through a process. They interview, they call up the folks, they try to find a fit for the staff and for the board, right? Same issue with the search firm. There are famous search firms, and each firm there are different people. You have to find a fit, right? The person who does this work or the firm that does this work have to have the same kind of set of values that you, because they are going to make decisions that affect the pool, and you need to fully be on board with those decisions, right? And many firms spend a fair amount of time engaging both staff and board in building the profile of the new ED. And so before I even go on to the section of building the profile, I want to share with you something that I've observed in the last 20 years. In the history of the organization, whether let's say the transition started in January, the ED left, and you have an interim. If you pick up the profile in January of what the new ED should be, and then you pick up the profile 3 months later in March, it's going to be a different profile, right? So because the profile in January is either identical to the ED who has left or opposite to the ED who's left. And then the profile in March or April is a profile of people kind of letting go, being more reflective, both grieving and angry or happy, and rethinking their commitment role, what the organization needs. So when you pick up the profile of the incoming, the new ED is super critical, right? So don't rush, right? Don't rush, put in the interim, let them settle, get the organization kind of emotionally stable, then pick up the profile. That's where the search firm does that. That profile is super critical because work and make sure you spend time agreeing on that profile. The reason for that is that when you start to interview, you will like people who do not meet that profile or don't meet it perfectly. And you as a board or staff will start to compromise and go, no, I like them so much, it doesn't matter what we wrote, but what we wrote is really, really critical. So spend the time developing the profile, understand that, and then use that to guide the process, because what you're going to have is 4 different interpretations of what you think you want in a new leadership. And the only thing that keeps all of you on the same page is, what did we think reflectively were the skill sets and the temperament and the strategic vision, when we picked up that profile. Right. This is where we also place the key piece. External firms charge you for a process that takes X amount of months. In not a lot of cases do they think through carefully and well about how to handle the internal candidate. So if you have an internal candidate that you really would like to interview and kind of flush through the system, make sure that that's a priority in the process with the search firm, or else the internal candidates are going to feel kind of alienated and kind of and left behind. And I've seen in so many cases where the internal candidate was really probably the best candidate, but by the time they got to the process, that the internal candidate decided that this process is too crazy, too long, too kind of non-supportive, they've checked out. So making sure that you embrace and assess the internal candidate early is really critical. If you want them, then you need to pursue them first, right? Then finally, about the search, particularly today. Any idea about how much you're going to pay your ED is probably wrong, right? They're going to be a lot more expensive than you think, right? And that is because the same person that you adore, so many other organizations also. And so the market right now is really difficult. So research it, be prepared, and know what you're willing to pay, and what are your risks. Right? And then I'm going to go to the last page on number 6. So this is an issue about onboarding, right? So onboarding is particularly in this particular context. Think about this. Let's assume that this process took 8 months. In this particular process, the executive committee or the transition committee has engaged with staff and know their kind of evolution in thinking in sync with the values, right, are fully engaged with stakeholders outside, banks, funders. They had the touch at least every 2 months, briefing, communication, right, and hopefully there is somewhere an extensive transition document where all the things are, right? And so at this point, the kind of natural impulse for most transition committees, great, you have that package. We've spent 8 months looking for you. The staff gave you the vote of confidence. Here, we'll pull back. And just as the earlier, question, that's actually all emotionally wrong. Your funders expect the every 60-day touch. So that has to be built into the transition plan for the ED. They have to touch these people. In time, you can pull it out longer, but there is that engagement, right? There is a relationship that board have developed with staff or volunteers. That relationship can't be cut off. It can be weaned off in time, right? But you'll have to think through that kind of process and how staff feels about it. And usually years after transition, the relationship with board and staff are going to be tighter for quite a bit, right? That's just because you created all these relationships and they're too valuable. You have to understand the boundaries, but they're too valuable to basically shut them off. And so all of that has to be written into the strategic priority of the ED, new ED, and all of that has to be worked out on how to make them, the new ED, successful, how to maintain this relationship, how to live through a period in which it is a little more intense, and then there's a less intense period, and then how to come back to the kind of dynamic tension of board and executive that runs the organization right, more fairly and equally. So I'm 7 minutes from 2 o'clock. So I'm open for questions. And all you've got to do is unmute and ask.
I have a
Hi,
question.
Paul. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jennifer. There is a chat question, Paul, I just want to make you aware of.
Sure. So the question is, so I did not see the chat question. All I saw was
Jennifer had a question. Why don't you go ahead and ask?
Sure, I would love to get your thoughts on starting to have the sensitive subject with you know, how to broach this with an executive director who may be considering retirement, to make sure that we have the leeway to implement a lot of these good steps. If you know, they haven't necessarily indicated that their intention, but it seems like in the next few years it might be likely.
I think that, so it depends a lot. If you're the chair of the board or you're on the board or on the executive committee, I think that that's a question you should ask your executive director, whether they don't plan to leave or plan to leave all the time, every year during their review. You know, part of this is planning for the organization, and a frank and above board conversation is good. Thinking about the organization is always good, and thinking about what is good for the ED and where they are in their career is also very good.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul. So I'm going to read a couple of questions that just came through. Tran asked, what are preventable mistakes that you see happen a lot during these transitions? And then earlier, Joanne had asked how to make a transition plan when ED abruptly leaves. And then there was another question, we'll wait, from Angela
Thank you.
Foster.
So let me, I don't have that great of memory. So the first question is, so I think that the you know, we started this talk about the fact that transition is about an organizational transition. Even if the ED has been there for a short period of time, this is an organizational transition issue. So if you think it in that context, how many people does it take to, how do you herd all of these people, get all their emotions straight and their job all figured out, all lined up. If you think through that, take a big step back, then I think you can anticipate that, right? It's like a family. If you're going to buy a new house in a family and there's a whole bunch of you, it's going to be a conversation. And you have to figure out a whole bunch of things, and people have very strong feelings about places where they are. They have the same strong feelings about the ED that they work with, both positive and negative. So I think if you see this as a process, as you see this as making sure that we need to make things right for a bunch of people and the system, that, and then if you want to know, those of us on the board here are happy to answer and give you advice. Just ping us. So the second question is, what do you do when an ED abruptly leaves, right? How do you do transition plan? Honestly, talk to those of us in this field. That's what we do for work, and we'll help you. We'll give you guidance. I would start with, what is the emotional hole that this person leaving have caused, and how long do you think it'll take to put it back, right? And then you've got to build a process in the middle, because that's basically what you want. You want at the end of that process, when the emotional hole is filled, so is the organizational hole, the organizational plan, and all of that. And if you do all the organizational plan and don't fill the emotional hole, then that transition is not a successful one. Another one, Dora?
Yep. So related to that one is, how do you hold an ED who leaves abruptly without a proper handover accountable?
It's called reputation. I don't think you can. But also, I also want to be sensitive. Some EDs who leave abruptly do so because they need to, and holding them back may not be good for your organization. I don't think you can hold people back. I think you do the best you can, leave and understand that this is about healing for the rest of the organization. The less grinding one does about all of this, the better.
Okay. Jessica asked, advice or resources on setting strategic priorities for first 12 to 18 months of new ED/leadership team.
I would say that you do that by basically the inverse of all the steps you put in during the transition, right? So during the transition, you have funders, staff funder engagement, staff engagement, communication, process, all of those. So you put all of that in. So all of them have to be completed, done, and kind of institutionalized. Those are the key pieces that arise when you do that. IEDs also, if you ask David, IEDs do assessments, and they leave behind pretty good documentation about what they think should be looked at, and the board should take that and incorporate that into the kind of strategic priorities.
Okay, this is Dennis. This is going to have been our final question, because we're kind of past 2 o'clock. We're going to stop the screen share now, and maybe we can see some folks. Paul, thank you so much. I want to tell you that when we used to do live in-person seminars and now with Zoominars, there's inevitably some attrition. Today, we lost maybe 1 or 2 people. And in fact, a couple of people joined us during the last 10 minutes. What does that mean? the information and the way it was delivered were absolutely essential, and you kept everyone's attention the whole time. So congratulations and thank you. That's fantastic. Looking
But
forward.
most importantly, you can find me at nonprofit.net. If you have transition question, please feel free to shoot them to me, and I will thoughtfully, hopefully, answer each one of them.
That's very gracious and generous of you. So thank you for that. Now, quickly, looking forward to our next Zoominar. If you think all boards are alike, you need to join us on November 15th to learn about the various board models that exist and how they work. It's going to be led by Abby von Schlegel, a board source certified governance trainer and a distinguished fellow of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. That's Tuesday, November 15th from 1 to 2 p.m. And please remember also, hundreds of organizations have benefited from our Zoominars. And the way we can keep them open to everyone without charge is your financial support. So please consider making a gift of $10, $20, whatever you can. And we're going to be emailing donation links and our feedback survey link. Thank you, and we hope to see you all on November 15th.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, we're rapidly losing folks, which as we would expect. So just thank you. I thought this just went so well. Will the recording be sent? Charmaine asks. We can tell you how to access it. So Dora, can you make a note of that?
Yep, I will be, yeah, you'll.
Yep, Charmaine got the message. Okay, thanks, Charmaine. All righty, well, hey, Margot. Okay, let's see.
Is Paul still on?
Yes, yep.
No, Paul.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a lot of wisdom based on a lot of experience in that webinar. I thought it was great.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Okay, folks. Well, thank you both for certainly for your help. Dora, always appreciated and always.
No, thank you. It was great. It was
Always
good.
needed. Too.
Yeah, it always gets a little hairy. It's always good practice too.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. You never know
all
what's
right.
going to happen. Okie dokie.
It's
Well,
great.
thanks once
Okay.
again.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.